Hi everyone, I'm BJ. I'm a genealogist and librarian and genealogy librarian in Maine. And today I want to talk about something very important, that not everything is online. Once you start really getting into your family history, you're going to find that you have questions that aren't answered by what's online. And sometimes you get really lucky and find offline sources that are fascinating. So I'm going to show you a few examples from my family just to see if I can whet your appetite for going local. Generally, this means to small historical societies and libraries, although sometimes it's bigger libraries and historical societies that just haven't had the money to digitize everything yet. So let's take a look at what you might find. First, here's a list of some of the things I've found over the years. Diaries, account books, day books. The account books might be for a family or for a business one of the family members ran. Family letters and photographs, compiled genealogies that older generations did. For example, I found a written family history done by my great grandfather's cousin that had some information that I could find elsewhere. Some I've managed to verify in other ways, and some I haven't verified yet. But since just about everything I have been able to verify has been true, I haven't completely ruled out the stuff I can't verify. Just because, if two-thirds, three-quarters of what's there that I've been able to verify is right, you have to give some of the benefit of the doubt to the stuff that I can't verify. I found cemetery maps that included unmarked graves or graves that are no longer there and who was in them. I have found wills and deeds that were never filed with a court. I found local history books. Sometimes they're, old mimeograph sheets with a staple holding it together. I've found newspapers and sometimes clipping books of things that haven't been digitized yet. One thing to keep in mind is things ended up in places you might not expect. For example, most of my ancestors lived in Essex County, Massachusetts, but I have found in one case, for example, couple greats grandmother whose sister ended up in Kansas. And so the letters from my great 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 grandmother to her sister are in a historical society in Kansas. I found diaries donated to the historical society where a grandchild lived. So that's something to keep in mind, is that items didn't necessarily stay where your ancestors stayed. So here was an easy one. I had an ancestor named Elizabeth Merriam who married Jesse Putnam. Jesse was a farmer in Danvers, Massachusetts. He and Elizabeth had a dozen kids. They were fairly prosperous, but they were farmers, and so I'm not sure Elizabeth really ever left Essex County, Massachusetts. But I put her name in Google and found this photograph of her in the Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada Public Libraries collection. And my guess is what happened is that a grandchild moved to Western Massachusetts or Central New York, and then that grandchild's grandchild moved over near the Niagara River, between Niagara County, New York, and what's now the Niagara region of Ontario, and somehow the photograph crossed the border, maybe with another grandchild's marriage or some sort of thing. And so this is the only picture I've ever found of her. So I got lucky. This one was digitized and online and had good metadata so that I found it. So sometimes Google is your friend on this. The other thing that can help, like here in Maine, the Maine Historical Society has a project they call the Maine Memory Network that has all sorts of digitized items from around the state. They have their own collection, and then they've worked with a bunch of organizations. As you can see, here's just the beginning of the list and a map showing where the organizations are. Most of these are very small little historical societies for small towns. And if you're wondering why there's nothing in the northwest corner of the state, it's because there's no people there. It's all timber lumbering, owned by paper companies for the most part. Um, but most of these organizations, they're small little historical societies, and they don't have the money or the expertise to run their own web archive. So they work with the Historical Society and the main memory network to get things online. So one of the things to do is look and see if there's something like this for the state, county, region where your ancestors lived or where they had relatives living, and see if you can find things there. So, as I said, many of my ancestors lived in Danvers, Massachusetts. So I went to the Danvers Archival Center and discovered that one of my grandfather's cousins had donated a bunch of family material, including this letter from my several greats grandmother, Julia Horton, to Mary Weston, the sister of Julia's future husband, Samuel Weston. And you'll notice my grandfather's cousin repaired these with Scotch tape. Please don't do that. It's not good for it helps the adhesive degrades the paper. But this is a really neat thing to have. And I only have a digital copy of it because it's safely preserved at the Danvers Archival Center. Also at the Danvers Archival Center, here is Samuel and Julia's son, William Lowe Weston. He, as a young man, you can see when he was in his 20s, he took a trip to Niagara Falls. And this is from the Upper Canada, so this is the Canadian side. Um, so, you know, I'm glad my grandfather's second cousin donated these and that they've been well preserved. Now, when I go to this is the it's a minimal web presence for the archival center. It's down. You see that beautiful library built drawing. This is down around in the basement, well, sort of first ground floor ish, in a modern addition. So it's what got good climate control and all of that. But their catalog is not online. If I go to the Peabody library that it's in and put in Weston, I got a whole bunch of modern stuff when I did it in the regular catalog. In History and Archives, there are 5 items, but they're actually not at Danvers. They're at other libraries in the system, in the area. So not much help that way. So what the website is good for is this. It gives you the contact information. And this is when you pick up the phone or you open up your email and you ask, do you have anything on this family? And that's why stuff is offline, but the website gives you the contact information. Another example, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania. This is actually William Lowe Weston ends up in Danvers, but he was born in Susquehanna County. And back when the internet was still a baby, I went up to Montrose, the county seat for Susquehanna County, and found this in a newspaper long before it was digitized. I love this. This is one of my favorite separation notices. As I hate to be interrogated, I have thought proper to take this method of informing my friends and enemies also that for reasons which to me appear sufficient, I have separated from my wife Julia Ann forever and ever. I will pay no debts if for contracting after this date. Should any persons feel desirous to know more than what I have here communicated, I would refer them to some of my neighbors who know more about the matter than I do. Samuel and Julia had been married at this point for 14 years. And the other thing I found there is Samuel's mother's diary, actually started by his stepfather, that she continued after his the stepfather's death. And so that same day, Mary Katie Tracy, Mary Katie Weston Tracy Miles, she married 3 times, wrote, Julie Ann Weston started for Baltimore with her brother W.L. Horton. Samuel Weston, her son, returned to his mother's house with son Charles and a servant maid. The other 2 children went with Julia. The oldest son stayed with Samuel. So, you know, this seems to say that Julia left, not Samuel, the marriage. So, um, there's a whole lot more to the story. There are more letters from their daughter, um, Julia Ann Horton Weston, and Samuel Weston had 3 kids. Charles, who stayed with his father, and then my couple great grandfather, William Lowe Weston, and then a daughter, Julia Weston. And Julia went back to visit in the 1840s and wrote letters to her brother Samuel that dance around what happened. Um, so I have a pretty good idea from that, and a letter that someone sent me a copy of that had been on sale at eBay for the stamp from this William Lowe Horton. Um, so it's not surprisingly there's a divorce, and Samuel remarries and all of that. But this is interesting detail that is not available anywhere else other than this essentially one-room historical society in a small town in Pennsylvania. Interestingly, before Julia Ann left, her mother, Sarah Horton, had committed suicide in 1822, and then in 1820, a year later in 1823, Samuel and Julia's house burnt down. So, and Samuel later dies of intemperance. So it's quite the story. But again, what's important here, there's not much online, but again, you can see they're on Facebook. They've got an email address and a telephone number. And I can tell you they're wonderful. The woman who's the librarian curator there is absolutely wonderful at all of this. And if they've got something, she'll help you get access to it. Here's another example. This isn't quite local, but I think it's a good example of how there are sometimes ways to find things. The Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential, which I've noticed I've misspelled, sorry, Library and Museum. What relevance does it have to our genealogy? Well, here's what it is. They've got an index to Ohio obituaries. And they've got almost 4 million obituaries and other genealogical relevant notices from Ohio from the 1810s to the present. They don't have the actual obituaries, but what happens is you find the information on the person. So, for example, here's a obituary from 1859, gives the parents' names, spouse's name, and then it tells you that he was born in Lincoln County, Maine, and then it tells you which newspapers it's in, and you can then contact a library that has that newspaper to get a copy of that, or look at the big online newspaper sources to see if it's there, and you've missed it because of a bad optical character recognition or some sort of thing like that. But yeah, once you start investigating, go offline sometimes. Um, Check with the historical societies near where your ancestor lived and where the people they were connected to lived to see if there's anything interesting. Have fun searching.